Speaker today is one of our very own. So Dr. Tim Schorn will be telling us some updates about the Middle East.
Right, I have two truths and a lie about the Middle East. Actually, no, I don't. So, I went minimalist today on the PowerPoint, so there are no fancy bells and whistles. We're just going to get right to the chaos. So, this is what we'll talk about today. Gaza is destroyed. Assad is gone. Nasrallah is dead. Iran is mad. Netanyahu is hungry, perhaps hangry. And the U.S. is the U.S. It sounds like Jeopardy categories or something. We'll just jump right in, and this will save more time for questions later. So this is the Middle East. I love maps, and I can't do anything without a map, even if it's not germane. But the places we're talking about are obviously all in there: Iran and Syria. We'll be looking at Israel and Lebanon and the Palestinian territories. So now, Syria. I think, and everything is a bit fuzzy for me anymore, but I think I talked about Syria here in, okay, good. Because I've been imagining a lot of things lately, so I was hoping that that one was true. So we talked about Assad being gone and how quickly it happened, and that even I was caught by surprise because I do spend a lot of time watching this stuff. The new leader is Ahmed al-Shara. Now, he is an Islamist, but one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that, like everything, there is a whole lot of diversity when it comes to Islamists. He's not the Taliban. He is not the Islamic State. Is he somebody we wish was a little different? Yes. But as Islamists go, we could do much worse. As Islamists go, we could do a little bit better. But he has been fairly moderate in his approach and fairly pragmatic. And the pragmatic aspect comes from the fact that he doesn't need extra enemies right now. He has enough. You still have a few holdouts of the Assad regime. Some fighting erupted over the last couple of months, but hasn't seemed to have gone anywhere. He doesn't want to be too bold in his Islamist ideology because Israel, nor does he want to be too bold in his Islamist ideology because of the United States and the Europeans. However, he does have core beliefs, so he is going to move forward based to some extent on those core beliefs. The question becomes, what is his relationship going to be with the Christian minority and the Alawite minority out of which Assad came? So far, he seems to be a bit welcome. That being said, there are still Alawites and Christians who long for the days of power and are going to continue fighting for that power, even if low level, which then always runs the risk that he'll become more hardline. But the jury is still kind of out. The jury is partially in. So far, he's not doing horribly. Two goals that may or may not be true. The first one is definitely true. He wants to keep Israel out. We'll discuss that more when we get to Israel. Once he took power and his party took power, Israel did send a message via explosive devices from the air. And that is probably not going to be helpful in any way, shape, or form, but we'll talk about that later. And the question becomes, the Assad regime was very friendly with Russia, gave them their only Navy base on the Mediterranean, gave them extra space for an expanded army and air base, but with Assad gone and with the Russians busy elsewhere, what does that mean for their bases in Syria? He has not said no to Russia. He has hinted at a qualified yes, Our question is, what could we do to prevent Russia from returning to Syria in the same force that they had before? And what we could do is to, quite frankly, reach out to al-Sharaa and attempt to start finding areas of commonality and building on those. However, anything we do to reach out to Syria can be completely undone by Israel's form of reaching out. And so we're going to have to try to prevent Netanyahu from becoming overly aggressive towards Syria simply because he needs to do that for domestic reasons. So while Sharaa wants to keep Israel out, we need to encourage Netanyahu not to become overactive. While al-Sharaa might be interested in allowing Russia back in to a limited extent, we need to do everything we can to encourage him not to do that. But again, that means reaching out to somebody who we would normally not be best friends with. And sometimes we're not great at that. Hezbollah in Lebanon. The leader of Hezbollah was killed, Nasrallah. He was the longtime leader of Hezbollah. Israel went after Hezbollah because of their little ongoing conflict for the last 40 plus years along the Lebanon-Israeli border. Interestingly, there has always been a script for that conflict. Hezbollah knows there are certain lines they're not supposed to cross. Israel knows there are lines they're not supposed to cross. And that could lead to incredibly ironic events such as Hezbollah killing an Israeli military officer and his driver, and Israel not responding because the script was the officer does not drive on that road. He drives on this road. If he drives on that road, he's fair game. If he drives on this road, he's protected. If he drives on the wrong road, he can be killed. That's part of the script. Israel understood that. Same way with hostage taking. The script has become, well, imagine a shredder. And both sides were starting to ignore the script. This led to a rather aggressive response from Israel, unsurprisingly. One of the things they did is they took out Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. That's a conversation for another day. But what has happened is that, to a great extent, the power of and influence of Hezbollah in Lebanon has been severely curtailed, undermined, reduced, which is both a good and a bad thing. The good thing is that it is eliminating a state within a state in Lebanon. It is eliminating a militia who failed to disarm when they were supposed to as a result of accords that brought the civil war to an end. The bad part is that Hezbollah was the first organization to really advocate for, fight for the Shiite population of Lebanon, which is at the very least a plurality, if not a majority. We don't know because there hasn't been a census in Lebanon since the 1930s. So prior to Hezbollah arising and arriving, the Shiites in Lebanon were disconnected from Lebanon in every way. The government would not provide health care. They would not provide electricity to Shiite villages. Education by Lebanese law was not allowed to be free, which meant that those who were poor could not afford to send their kids to school, and that would have been premised on the idea of schools being provided to them in those villages anyway. And so one of the things that Hezbollah did was take care of all those things. They built schools. They dug the wells. They provided the electricity. They provided health care. They actually ended the cultural practice of a widow having to marry her brother-in-law. They said, no, what we need to do is provide for widows so they aren't forced into marriage. So Hezbollah did all of that because the Lebanese government wouldn't do any of that. So the question becomes, are the Lebanese Shiites powerful enough, ingrained in the system enough, organized enough to protect their interests and to advocate for themselves outside of Hezbollah? And the answer is probably not. So when we look at Hezbollah, it's not as easy as just saying they're terrorists, because they were also providing social services. After conflicts between Israel and Lebanon, it was always Hezbollah who was ahead of the game in rebuilding civilian infrastructure. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens in Lebanon. This is a great opportunity for the Lebanese government to move forward, to ensure that another militia doesn't arise, and to unify the country. They will miss that opportunity. They will, in fact, ignore it altogether, probably. So I have high hopes. Gaza. I always inundate you with numbers when it comes to Gaza because I think we are oftentimes unaware of the absolute humanitarian catastrophe that it is. As of July 3rd, 2025, the Gaza Health Ministry has named 57,645 Palestinians killed. Now, we know that the American government, both under Biden and Trump, and the Netanyahu government have said, don't believe the Gaza Health Ministry, they make up their numbers, we have no idea really of telling. Research has shown that, in fact, if anything, in past conflicts, the Gaza Health Ministry has underestimated the number of dead. They do not declare a casualty, a dead casualty, unless they can put a name and a place to that person. And so these are the dead that they have identified. The Lancet, which is a British medical journal, says that the Gaza Health Ministry is probably underestimating by about 30%. So the Lancet, based on their numbers today, it would probably be closer to 80,000. 60% are women, children, and elderly. Notice a segment of population that is missing from there. Men. To eliminate the discussion and disagreement about whether the male was a member of Hamas or a militia and was fighting, they just separated them out from any potential civilian identity, which means the number of civilians is probably higher, but at the very minimum, 60% of the casualties have been women, children, and the elderly. Most research that has been carried out said actually the number of civilian casualties is probably 80%. But again, by separating out all of the fighting age men, you eliminate the disagreement and discussion about the minimum number of civilians killed. There's an expectation that there are still thousands more in the rubble that they may never get to. It has the highest number per capita of child amputees in the world, and obviously that's horrific enough. The other horrific part is the majority of hospitals have been destroyed. So we're operating without medical care of the kind they need. 100% of Gaza residents face acute levels of food insecurity. 70,000 children and 17,000 mothers face acute malnutrition. 470,000 face catastrophic hunger. That is about 22% of the population. And there have been numerous towns simply razed. Hospitals, everything destroyed. So the problem that we're facing is that the killing and destruction continues, which makes the likelihood of rebuilding even less. Now, we know that there is an organization that has been created, and an organization, we mean an American corporation, the Gaza Humanitarian Corporation, and that's too easy, but has been created. It is registered in Delaware. It is backed by the US and the Israeli government. They are known for being untrained, prone to violence, and it was discovered they also had a secret plan for removing the Gazan population from Gaza. So they have not been warmly welcomed by anyone other than the Israelis and the Americans. They have opened fire on the Gazans who were trying to get food. So we don't see a lot of hope in Gaza, and we'll talk about that more when we get to my good friend Bibi Netanyahu. So, Iran. It's like every relationship status. It's complicated. So, we know what happened. What we don't necessarily know is why all of this happened. We know that prior to the first administration of President Trump, there was an agreement, not a treaty, an agreement between Iran, the United States, France, Germany, Britain, and a couple of others to eliminate any program that could have been used for creating nuclear weapons. Now, there might have been a couple areas, there were probably a couple areas where they were not completely forthcoming. In all of the other areas, they were completely ahead of schedule. And then we withdrew from the agreement during the first administration of President Trump, and I would argue we withdrew from it because it was not accomplishing things that it was not intended to accomplish, which then raises some questions. We've always been concerned about their ballistic missile technology, and so we were upset that they were not curbing that. Well, guess what was not part of the original agreement? Ballistic missile technology. We were upset that they continued to support Syria, Hezbollah, to a lesser extent Hamas, and the Houthis. What was not part of the original agreement? That. So what we were concerned about was not part of the original agreement, and so rather than seeking diplomatic responses and progress on those issues, we simply withdrew, at which point Iran figured we have nothing to lose and ramped up their program. Were they creating nuclear weapons? No. Were they creating the infrastructure and superstructure to build nuclear weapons? Yes. And that is something that needs to be, kind of defined and distinguished and et cetera. They were ramping up their enrichment of uranium. Now, we would normally think that as you enrich uranium from 5% to 20% to 70% to 80%, that it takes longer the closer you get to that 90 to 100% you're after. That's actually false. It becomes easier to make that next advancement, which means then we were concerned when they were hitting the 60 to 80% mark that they were only perhaps weeks or months from getting the type of uranium they needed from nuclear weapons, and that was true. But had they started putting together nuclear weapons, did they have the ability to create nuclear weapons? No. I would argue that the attacks were for a different reason, and we'll get to that when we get to my good friend Bibi Netanyahu. So now the problem is that through the course of the attacks, we have the law of unintended consequences. The Iranian regime under Ayatollah Khamenei was not popular amongst Iranians. What's the best way to make a government, if not more popular, more protected and supported by the people? Attack them. It's the rally around the flag thing. And so, while we might talk about regime change, we just made it less likely. Second, the Arab enemies of Iran have now become more sympathetic to Iran. Saudi Arabia, who was, never expect a Saudi government to remain consistent. Because while they were all excited for years about somebody destroying Iran, now all of a sudden, once Israel and the United States has taken steps, they've decided, oh, the problem is that when you destroy Iran, somebody else has to fill that vacuum. And who's filling it? Israel. Who do the Saudis trust less than Iran? Israel. Despite the fact that there were ongoing, at least secret, sometimes public negotiations, trade agreements, etc., between the Saudis and the Israelis, they have now pulled back on that. And so have other Gulf states. It also means that it's less likely that Arab countries will publicly or even privately talk to Israel, which undermines the whole notion of the Abraham Accords. And that is, I would consider to be very unfortunate, because for stability in the Middle East to be long-lasting, those folks have to talk to each other. And they won't be, at least for a while. And now the Arab states are going to be less inclined to work with the U.S. Because they see us as the other force behind Israel and the other force attacking Iran. And I also find that somewhat, disappointing, because there's going to be a price to pay domestically. Even in dictatorships, you occasionally have to listen to your people. And this is going to be problematic for some of those leaders to actually continue to move forward talking to the U.S. Now, Israel. Gosh, I've never, been this far ahead on time, ever. So I'll slow down, I'll start throwing in some more topics, I don't know what, but we'll think of something. So Israel. Oftentimes, we've heard of this whole notion of wag the dog. And there was a movie about a fictionalized account of perhaps the Clinton administration, the tail wagging the dog. And this is what's happening here, is that so much of what Israel is doing now is based not on real security concerns, but on domestic politics. And that never provides for clear, far-sighted strategic thinking. What it does provide for is, how do we hang on to our majority in the next elections? Or how do we keep our current majority together? And so I would argue that most of what Israel has done or continued to do, the continued attacks against Hamas, the continued attacks on Syria, the most recent and fairly aggressive attacks on Iran, have not been about real security concerns, but have been an attempt by Prime Minister Netanyahu to keep his majority together, because he has one or two parties in his majority who are aggressive, very proactive, shall we say. And he needs them, because if he loses them from his coalition, he loses power. If he loses power, there are new elections. If there are new elections, he may or may not be returned to power. And if Benjamin Netanyahu likes anything, it's being prime minister, because it also protects him from being, prosecuted for corruption, because his case is still before the courts. So, the first goal of Israel is to keep Netanyahu in power. The second goal is to remove those who are enemies and who they consider to be enemies. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Iranian regime. And the question becomes, and I'll get to this in a moment, is once you have eliminated them or removed their power, what next? Politics abhors a vacuum. And so we'll think about that. Now, the third goal then is to keep Netanyahu in power. So, which leads us to the fourth goal, which is for some of the members of the Israeli cabinet expand Israel, which requires population transfer and thankfully, I don't have to just, figure out what they're implying. A number of them have been very straightforward. We need to remove the Palestinians from Gaza. They've been absolutely upfront about that. We need to remove some of the Israeli citizens who are Arab from Israel. We need to have certain votes on the future of Israel that should be limited to Jewish Israelis and disenfranchise the other 25% of the Israelis. We need to remove some of those Palestinians living in the West Bank. And the problem that Israel faces is that you have an increasing number of elected officials being willing to talk about that publicly. Now, when we talk about population transfer, if you look up legal definitions, it's also known as genocide. So they want to expand Israel. And the fifth goal then is to keep Netanyahu in power. All of this revolves around him staying in power. And one of the problems is that there are real concerns for Israel. The additional problem is that Netanyahu tends to use them to advance his own political future. And that is problematic for everyone. And then us. You can't spell the U.S. without us, or us without the U.S., one of the two. It has been, for the most part, a bipartisan agreement since the 1960s that we need to not just enable the existence of Israel, but need to protect their existence. And we didn't jump in that full force until the late 1960s. But bipartisan agreement has been that we need to protect Israel. There is an added part to that, and sometimes it is that we need to protect Israel from itself. And we have not been doing that of late, which is why now Israel finds itself, a bit of an outcast, not just in the Middle East, but in the international community. And that could have been prevented by more honest, forthright talk and actions by the United States. And we missed that opportunity. We're always into battering Iran. I did an interview last week on Iran, and I said that Iran is not a threat to the United States. Someone took issue with that. I will stand by that. Iran cannot threaten the United States. Can it attack some of our interests? Yes. Is it going to undermine the security of the United States? No. So there are complicating factors there. What about the Houthis and their attacks on American ships? This is where we need to go to that second, third, and fourth level of analysis. Why are the Houthis attacking American ships? Why are the Iranians supporting the Houthis? Why are the Houthis being battered by Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and others? And so in those areas where Iran's friends are carrying out attacks against some of our interests, we need to ask why that is occurring. And the Houthi question is deep. And what it is self-fulfilled prophecies. And so they have begun carrying out attacks against Western ships. And the question is why? And the answer is because we said they were a threat, somebody came to support them, and now we consider them all threats. We want to keep the oil moving. So, there we have it. I mean, that's something that we've been doing since the 1940s and 50s, and we will continue to keep that moving. But One of my concerns is that right now we don't have some of the expertise we need in the State Department to focus on long-term issues in the Middle East. The United States has always been a bit not good at thinking strategically in the Middle East other than how do we keep the oil flowing and how do we protect Israel. And my concern is now that a lot of that expertise is lacking. Not that we ever listened to the expertise anyway, but now it's not even there. And so my concern is that we're not thinking strategically about what's next for the Middle East. So, what could go wrong? There is a complete change in the balance of power by eliminating Iran as a power, by kind of sidelining the Saudis, by eliminating Assad, which, by the way, I'm all for, and I had plans for that early on, but nobody listened to me. I consider that a good. The problem is that we now have essentially a hegemonic power in the Middle East. What happens when you have a hegemon? Well, if they're at their peak, there's only one way they can go. And if there's only one at the top, what are the others going to do? They're going to start talking to each other. And they're going to start planning and plotting. And this is probably what's going to happen. I was just reading, and I can't remember which book I was reading, but they talked about, a historian was talking about a power vacuum. And he noted that a power vacuum doesn't occur when there is no one to fill this empty space. A power vacuum occurs when there are too many entities who want to fill that space. And right now we're creating a power vacuum in the Middle East, and we're going to eventually have other countries who decide we need to fill that vacuum. You know, whether Egypt, the Saudis, down the road, who knows who. And unfortunately, the region is now more suspicious of the United States, which is never in our interest, I would argue. So this is where the Middle East is today. Sigh. I remember back in the late 1990s, well, actually it was mid to late mid 1990s, where I was almost optimistic. And it has been, see, I hit my peak optimism. And there's only one way to go. And it's been a steady slide since then, and I keep digging the basement deeper. So were it a game, it would be interesting to watch and start moving pieces around. But as we know, these games are also, have a humanitarian or a human price and create humanitarian crises on occasion. So, and with that, look at that. I left time for some questions today. Yes.
So listening to this, I wondered if some heavily armed masked men are going to be bursting in and take you to alligator outfits.
Yeah. Absolutely.
If you were on an international visa, could you get away with this?
No. No. In fact, I was just reading an article where faculty members in the U.S. who are not citizens or are recent citizens have begun cutting back on what they say and write. Which, in my area, and one of the organizations I belong to, used to belong to, the Middle Eastern Studies Association, that's a real chill. So, no. Yeah. Because I think this is when we need these discussions. Ross.
I've got a couple questions.
Yes.
I thought that there was a real strategic opportunity in Syria that we may have missed. Is it still there that we could take advantage of what was there? That's and it kind of goes with the second portion, and that is, what has Russia done? I mean, when we attacked and bombed Iran, I zero response from Russia. What's going on with Russia? Why haven't they at least said something?
Yeah. So if you didn't hear Ross's questions, the first was, he was concerned, did we miss a strategic opportunity with Syria? And yes, we did. And we've been missing it since 2013. Do we still have an opportunity to seize a strategic initiative? Yes, we do. And that means engaging with, whether we like them or not, the people who are in power. The question that follows that is, will we seize that strategic initiative? And the answer is no. No, we won't. The second part is, we attacked Iran. Where's Russia in this? Well, unfortunately, there seem to be some discussions amongst the BRICS, including Russia, India, China, about a more unified response to the United States. Now, will it be military? No. Will it be political and economic? Yes. Will it make a difference? No. But I think there is some concern that amongst countries that the United States needs to be pushed back against, and certainly Russia and China may attempt that. China would do it not in the Middle East, and Russia would do it in the Middle East and Europe. So I am concerned there, yes. Yes?
Yeah, if it is true that Israel wants to expand and take over Gaza,
Yep.
where are the 2.3 million Palestinians going to go?
Now, do you want my answer or Israel's answer?
I think we'd like to hear about it.
Israel's answer is, we will send them to Jordan and Egypt, and maybe, I don't think they've mentioned Iraq, but that's always a possibility. Their attitude is, we can find different homes for them. The answer from Jordan and Egypt is, in Arabic, hell no. What is my answer? I think the best that they could hope for is that they try to focus the Palestinian population in one part of Gaza. Now, Gaza is already one of the most densely populated areas in the world. So if you're going to try to push over 2 million Gazans into an area that's already, Gaza is 1/3 the size of Clay County. Well, let's put them in 1/15 the size of Clay County. That's going to be difficult. And so, honestly, the people who are advocating this policy on behalf of Israel don't care where they go as long as they can. Is it realistic? It shouldn't be. But what happens if you just start driving them across the border into Egypt? Are the Egyptians going to shoot them? Yes. So I think it's problematic at best. So, in the back row.
Where do Dubai and Qatar and the Arab Emirates, all those other countries get involved in this?
At this point, I mean, a lot of them were opposed to Iran. They weren't necessarily fans of Hamas, but their concern now is that Israel has overreached, and I think they will back Saudi in the kind of pulling back from negotiations with Israel. The Emirates, Qatar, probably Kuwait, had been moving forward with Israel fairly, markedly. But my guess is that's going to be over now. And it's interesting, we and the Israelis destroy, and then we expect the Gulf countries to pay for the reconstruction. So, go ahead. Yeah, oh, go ahead, yeah,
So when Assad was taken from power, he went to Russia.
right.
Where is he now? Is he still there and does he have any influence?
He is still in Russia, and he has little to no influence. He still has some loyalists in Syria, but I don't think they're going to be able to make much of a play. So you had a question.
Two questions.
Yeah.
Where do you see this Middle East in 5 to 10 years, and how do you gather, filter your information between politics, White House, all those countries and everything to come with
Yep.
a accurate conclusion?
Where do I see it in 5 years? Honestly, I don't know. I don't know. And so much of it is going to depend on, well, it's going to depend on two entities, Netanyahu and his coalition, and the president du jour of the United States. And we have had, I would argue, zero strategic thinking on the Middle East for well over a decade. And if there was any strategic thinking and I think Ross agrees with me, perhaps. I may have just caused Ross to have a stroke. I don't know, I'm sorry. But, and the problem is if there was any strategic thinking before that, it was awfully quiet. And this is a problem. I mean, if you're going to be a superpower or the superpower who benefits from what the world is and how the world relates to each other, I would argue you have some sense of responsibility to help figure things out. And we have not been doing that of late. And honestly, I would go back to my mental timeline is going, and I'm not even sure where I'd go back to at this point. We had a great opportunity at the end of the Cold War. We blew it. So, but yeah. Somebody else had that.
Maybe one more?
Oh, sure.
One last question?
All right. Well, yeah, no more questions. Oh, yes.
It seems to me like the future relationship between Russia and Syria may be a key indicator of that, may be the status of the Russian sea base, the naval station. Is there any movement there?
Yes. The current Syrian government has said that they are not necessarily opposed to a Russian return. The question becomes how big of a Russian return. And that's why I think it is so important for us to start engaging in diplomacy now, because I don't like the Russians in the Mediterranean. I'm an old Cold Warrior, darn it. And I always felt that the Cold War was a Russian empire versus us, and it still is. And, I forgot part of your question, and that is how do we filter all this? I tend to ignore fairly ecumenically everything that comes out of Washington. And I don't like doing that, but oftentimes what's true is distorted as intelligence moves up. And we've seen that going all the way back to forever. I have the benefit, and this isn't a brag, this is just what I've been doing, of watching the Middle East since I was in graduate school, and I had a really, really good mentor who I think kind of set me on the right path. And so, there are certain authors I believe, there are certain press reports that most of the newspapers we look at, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times, London Guardian, their news is going to be factual. Now, then I have to look at those who are doing op-ed pieces, how much do I trust them? And there are some who I trust, and there are some who are political hacks. And I think when you start asking them, at least in your mind, why, it becomes apparent who the hacks are. So and one of the places I go to is, interestingly enough, Al Jazeera, English. because they have a different perspective that you're not going to get in the United States. And their news is usually, as the Brits say, spot on. It's just stuff that you're not going to get here. So in 5 years, I'll be back, and I will reinforce the idea that I have no idea what's going to happen. So thank you all.
Thank you, Tim. Insightful as always. Thank you all. Did the sign-up sheet make it to all the tables? Did it go around? No, it didn't.
We need the county fair one over here.
So let's, yeah,
They're on the same clipboard.
it's on the same clipboard, so let's kind of get that circulating a little bit better as we finish things up here. We will, do our 50-50 real quick.